Welcome to Under the Microscope. I'm your host, Amy Ahern, and today we are looking at gifted education, examining a few of the myths and misconceptions surrounding this controversial aspect of education, and perhaps getting to the bottom of a few of them. George Orwell once said, "Myths that are believed intend to become true." It is through the lens of this idea that we'll be looking at a few myths common among educators of gifted students. But first, let's unpack this quote a little. If I may be so bold as to paraphrase George Orwell, he is describing a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is, a prediction or belief that in fact causes itself to be true. The prophecy here causes itself to be true as a result of the consequential behavior associated with that belief. To illustrate this, one of the more common examples of the self-fulfilling prophecy in education is the teacher who has assumed early on in the year that a student is of low ability. The teacher consequently treats this student in a way befitting of this belief, including a lack of challenging work, language modifications, lower order thinking tasks, etc., and is therefore highly unlikely to see high performance from this student, no matter their actual ability. The teacher's belief caused itself to be true. The student was believed to be of low ability and as such was. Today we will be looking at 3 myths common in gifted education. We will explore exactly what the myth is and what makes it believable, what causes the myth to appear true, that is, the self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of the myth, and we will look briefly at some counter-evidence, explaining why this myth is a myth and also a little about how to counteract its negative consequences. As always, I will be providing citations throughout this episode, and a full reference list can be found at the conclusion. So let's take a look at myth number 1. Myth number 1 today is that a patch-on approach to gifted education is sufficiently comprehensive. A patch-on approach to gifted education programs describes interventions or strategies that are not linked in a logical way and are not part of a wider philosophy or ethos. They have been patched on, as it were, to the regular curriculum, as opposed to being an integral part of it. There are a number of reasons as to why a patch-on approach may have been adopted at yours or any other school. Firstly, Brown and Garland explored infrastructural issues in the United States as their example. They cite a lack of teacher training, a lack of specialized schools and programs, and limited funding at every level of government, as well as a total lack of mandate when it comes to gifted education, as a cause of why the patch-on approach may be so pervasive in the education landscape. Now, while you may be sitting there thinking, this research is from the US, it doesn't apply to me, surely things are better here in Australia. Well, I give to you Mirica Gross, who has carried out her research in Australia and assures us that we are no better in this arena and have some real issues around the ideas of intellectual elitism to boot. Schools are generally left to their own devices to decide what is best for them when it comes to gifted education, how best to implement it, and what exactly will be included in that implementation. And with limited access to training and little money associated with gifted education, it is little wonder teachers believe a patch-on approach to gifted education is what the system should be and what it is set up to do. Secondly, many teacher training programs include at least a small component on special education. Conversely, very few teacher training programs mandate a gifted education portion at all. Governmental policy also tends to be heavily skewed towards this end of the achievement scale. We need look no further than the incredibly well-publicized example of the No Child Left Behind policy in the United States to see this. Research suggests that gifted students are the unintended victims of noble programs such as these targeted towards low achieving and special needs students. While of course it is absolutely imperative to cater to the learning needs of all students, including those with learning disabilities, to help them achieve their potential, is it not also just as important that we allow gifted students the same right? A half-hearted, inconsistent strategy here and there is just not going to give you that. Finally, Tomlinson in their research describes the absolute importance of at least a key group of supporters within the school staff in order for a gifted education program to be meaningful and adequately comprehensive. Imagine a teacher alone, if you will, trying to account for the enriched learning of all schools' gifted students without any support from executive staff, let alone a committee or core planning group. You almost can't fault them for applying a patch-on approach in the face of that sort of challenge. So, how does the belief that a patch-on approach to gifted education programming is sufficient become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Robinson sums up the research nicely on this point. A patch-on approach to gifted education programming serves as a comfort to the programmer that they have ticked the box and are meeting their learners' needs. Moreover, the fact that a patched-on program generally includes no accountability or regular evaluation makes this delusion even easier to swallow. Also, the fact that whatever insufficient strategies or interventions are put in place will likely work for some of your gifted students some of the time. Perhaps, for instance, you have a gifted student at maths who is really excelling with the accelerated content you have given her as per your school's maths acceleration program. That's great and should probably be continued. However, is it helping the unidentified gifted writer who is desperately bored in her mainstream classroom? The answer is that it is just not. It is not catering to that kind of learner at all. But it is terribly hard to have that sort of perspective on a program without training and a grounding in the research. So what does the research say to counter the argument for the patch-on approach? Robinson states that the research on this topic simply does not support the myth that there is one intervention that is going to cater to all gifted students at a school. It is up to the school to devise a multifaceted program that includes interventions across a range of platforms in a range of giftedness areas. It is also necessary to weave a good education program into the regular curriculum, linking it to the school's ethos and allowing for plenty of evaluation and modification as necessary. In short, we are tasked with providing what Robinson describes as a mosaic of services that meets the needs of all our gifted learners across all abilities and across all grade levels. Let's move on now to our second myth, that gifted students are always high performers. Folk wisdom tells us that gifted students, through their exceptionally high ability, will present themselves to us through their equally exceptionally high standard of work. It is this belief that has seen a reliance of grades and standardized test scores for the identification of gifted students persevere for as long as it has. This high performance expectation is simply not always the case and takes us to the well-researched subgroup of gifted students known as underachievers. Underachievers are students who exhibit a severe discrepancy between their expected achievement, or achievement matched to their ability, and their actual achievement. They make up to half of all gifted students and are certainly not going to be identified through grades or standardized tests, let alone present themselves as gifted in the classroom right there for you. So, why has this myth emerged? What makes it so believable? Well, the New South Wales Department of Education lists a number of characteristics typically associated with gifted students, including curiosity, a passion for learning and insightfulness, as well as many others. In its policy on gifted students identification, the Department of Education cautions teachers to not focus too heavily on these positive characteristics like the ones I just mentioned. As tempting as it may be to gravitate towards the teacher-pleaser gifted student you have, we simply cannot ignore the frustrated gifted student who is constantly distracting his friends at the back of the room. Moreover, there is no one identification procedure that is going to fit every gifted student in a school. Cooper describes how this is just an unfair way to approach gifted education. Students present themselves in all sorts of ways and in all areas of ability. Your school's identification procedures must be equally as broad. Also, a range of program interventions is absolutely necessary. This harks back to what I was saying earlier about the patch-on effect to gifted education programming. One or two haphazard strategies does not a gifted program make. Gifted students just aren't going to rise up out of such a policy. So how does the myth that gifted students are always high achievers make itself true? It is no coincidence that gifted underachievers often go unnoticed. They are inherently tricky to identify. All sorts of internal factors can lead to underachievement, including poor attitudes towards school, maladaptive social comparison to other students, a troubled relationship with the teacher, and a mismatch between the teacher's goals for learning and the student's goals for learning. Moreover, external factors, including gender, family dynamics, socioeconomic background, ethnicity and cultural background, twice exceptionality, that is, the twin diagnosis of giftedness and a disability, and overexcitabilities also all have profound effects on a gifted student's achievement level. All of these factors affect a student's performance in different ways and require specific interventions to reverse the underachievement. This is certainly no easy task, and unless paid proper attention by a trained, passionate educator, may go unchecked altogether, thus leaving these underachievers out of the school's official gifted population and perpetuating the myth that the school's gifted students are all high achievers simply because they're not counting the underachievers. So what does the research say about all of this? As mentioned, underachievers are thought to make up to 50% of gifted students. They are a significant part of the literature, including research cited directly by the Department of Education of New South Wales. Their very existence of this large portion of the gifted population contradicts the existence or the validity of the myth that gifted students are all high achievers. And perhaps even more importantly, the research stresses the importance of a multifaceted identification program matched by an equally multifaceted range of program interventions. Myth 3 looks a little more closely at one of these program interventions, and the myth that accelerating gifted students will have detrimental effects on their social and emotional well-being. Acceleration, that is, the strategy of pacing a gifted student's learning at rates faster than that of their peers, has a long history of criticism. Schader and Brookshire describe the general acceptance among educators of acceleration's positive academic benefits, but a real question as to the social or emotional effect. So much so that acceleration is often discounted as a viable option in schools for this very reason. However, as we shall see, these fears are hugely unwarranted in the face of piles of research and are putting a seriously useful program intervention in the shadows for almost no reason at all. So, how has this myth emerged? The emergence and perpetuation of this myth can be put down to two main factors. Firstly, Schader and Brookshire point out the prevalence of preconceived opinions cited by professionals in their decisions to not use acceleration in their schools, as opposed to facts or even personal experiences. Let me say that again. These teachers are not even referring to anecdotal evidence of any kind. They're using opinions that appear to have simply been passed down from teacher to teacher. Now, teaching is certainly a craft, and mentors, collaboration, and sharing of wisdom is one of the great things about the profession. However, it is also, quite possibly, one of the reasons why acceleration is so underused in Australian schools. This can be, and usually is, counteracted by training. However, the research points to a real lack of training when it comes to acceleration or even gifted education in general. Wood, Portman, Segran, and Colangelo found that less than 50% of professionals had undergone any sort of training in gifted education. This leaves our teachers woefully underinformed about what works and what does not, and through no fault of their own. So how does the myth that acceleration has detrimental social and emotional effects on gifted students make itself true? How is this prophecy fulfilling itself? Well, this is simply put by the fact that it is so rarely used. If community wisdom states acceleration is harmful to students' mental well-being, and teachers have had no training or on-the-job experience with any other reality, why should they believe otherwise? So what does the research say on the effects of acceleration? The research gives a resounding thumbs up to acceleration's use for gifted students and has found a broad range of positive effects, including academic benefits, but also students have an easier time making friends, they experience increased self-esteem. Acceleration mitigates the gifted student's typical forced choice between high academic performance and learning goals with social satisfaction. It reduces the social stigma commonly associated with the very bright. It reduces the likelihood of underachievement as explored earlier and unhealthy perfectionism. It heightens feelings of acceptance for the gifted student, and it increases their academic self-concept, showing that it makes them feel better about school and about themselves at school. As you can see, the research has some pretty powerful counterarguments to the unfounded folk wisdom that acceleration will harm the gifted student more than it will help. All these myths have self-fulfilled and become true to an extent in the Australian education landscape. However, the thread tying each and every one of these myths together is the importance for teachers to be educated about gifted education and to be supported in their planning and implementation for their gifted students. In my experience, education is a powerful antidote to mythology. So have a think. Are there any myths surrounding gifted education in your school or educational context? What are they, and how can you mitigate their self-fulfilling effects? Perhaps through training, perhaps collegial support, probably a combination of both. Thank you for tuning in for today's episode of Under the Microscope.